They laughed when the veteran paid $5 for a burnt foundation and a lonely chimney. But when the deadliest winter storm hit Wyoming, that same chimney became the one thing that kept him and his German shepherd alive. In a small Wyoming valley called Red Hollow, people believed they had seen every kind of mistake a man could make. But the day Caleb Walker arrived, with nothing but an old pickup truck and a loyal German shepherd named Shadow, they believed they were witnessing the biggest mistake of all. The land he bought looked worthless, just blackened dirt and a tall brick chimney standing alone in the wind. What no one in town realized was that the chimney still held a secret powerful enough to defeat a Wyoming winter. Before we begin, tell me in the comments, where are you watching this story from today? The wind that rolled across Red Hollow carried the smell of pine, dust, and something colder. Something that warned newcomers they were far from any easy life. Caleb Walker noticed it the moment he drove into town. His old pickup rattled along the two-lane road that cut through the valley like a scar in the land. Snow still clung to the distant shoulders of the Wind River Range, even though the calendar insisted it was only early October. Around here, winter never truly left. It only stepped back long enough to catch its breath. In the passenger seat sat a large German shepherd with dark eyes and a calm, watchful posture. Shadow. The dog's ears twitched as they passed the faded wooden sign that read, Red Hollow, population 412. Caleb slowed the truck and rolled through the small town square. A few pickups were parked near the feed store. Two older men leaned against a railing outside the general store, drinking coffee from paper cups. They both looked up as the truck passed. One of them nodded toward the dog. "That's a big shepherd," the man muttered. The other shrugged. "Probably military." He wasn't wrong. Caleb parked near the courthouse building, where a small crowd had gathered. A handwritten sign taped to the door read, County Tax Auction. Land Sale Today. Shadow jumped down from the truck bed the moment Caleb opened the door. The dog stretched, shook his coat, and immediately moved to Caleb's side like he had done thousands of times before. Some habits never left a soldier. Inside the courthouse, the air smelled of old paper and dust. About a dozen locals filled the folding chairs set up in front of a small desk where the county clerk shuffled paperwork. Most of the people looked like ranchers, weathered faces, heavy jackets, hands shaped by years of work. Caleb sat in the back. Shadow lay at his feet. The auction moved slowly. A few parcels of grazing land sold first. Then an abandoned shed outside town. A strip of creek bank that two ranchers quietly argued over. Caleb listened but said nothing. Then the clerk cleared his throat. "Next parcel," he announced. "Property located 5 miles north of town. Former Hollis property." A few people chuckled softly. The clerk continued reading. "Structure destroyed by fire 8 years ago. Remaining features include stone foundation and brick chimney. Property currently delinquent on county taxes." He paused. "Opening bid, $5. More chuckling. One of the ranchers in the front row leaned back in his chair. "That old ruin," he said. "You couldn't give that place away." Another man added quietly, "Winter'll finish what the fire started." The clerk looked around the room. "Any bids?" Silence. Wind rattled the courthouse windows. Then Caleb raised his hand. "I'll take it." Every head in the room turned. The clerk blinked once, surprised. $5, he repeated. He glanced around again. Any higher bids?
No one spoke. The gavel tapped the desk.
Sold!
A low murmur moved through the room.
Caleb signed the paperwork, folded the receipt, and walked back outside into the cold sunlight. Shadow trotted beside him. A tall rancher with gray stubble and a worn denim jacket stood near the courthouse steps, watching. His name was Hank Dawson. Everyone in Red Hollow knew him. Hank tilted his head slightly as Caleb approached. "You the one who bought that burnt foundation?" Caleb nodded once. "That's right." Hank studied him for a moment, then glanced down at Shadow. "Mind if I ask why?" Caleb looked toward the distant mountains. "Needed somewhere to start." Hank let out a short laugh. "Son," he said, "that place ain't a start." He pointed north. "That land's wide open prairie. Wind comes straight down from the mountains. No trees, no shelter." He shook his head slowly. "When winter hits 40 below, a man with a good house and 8 cords of wood still has trouble sleeping." His eyes moved to Shadow again. "You and that dog won't last a week." Caleb didn't answer. He simply opened the truck door and let Shadow jump into the passenger seat. Hank watched the truck drive away until it disappeared down the dirt road leading north out of town. 20 minutes later, Caleb pulled off the road and parked beside a stretch of open land. Grass rolled across the prairie in slow waves beneath the pale Wyoming sky. In the middle of that empty land stood what remained of the Hollis property, a blackened stone rectangle, and a chimney, 30 feet tall. Red brick against the sky. Caleb stepped out of the truck. Shadow followed immediately. The wind moved across the grass with a low, whispering sound. The burnt foundation was exactly what the clerk had described. Nothing but charred stones outlining what had once been a house. Every board was gone. Every beam burned long ago. Only the chimney remained. Shadow walked ahead of Caleb and climbed over the stone edge of the foundation. The dog sniffed the ground carefully, moving in slow circles. Caleb stepped inside the ruin. The soil inside the foundation was darker than the surrounding prairie, stained with old ash from the fire. The chimney rose from the center of the space like a lonely tower. Caleb walked toward it slowly. He reached out and placed his hand against the brick. Cold, but solid. Whoever had built it had known their work. Shadow suddenly stopped moving. The dog stood very still beside the chimney. His ears pointed forward, his nose pressed against the brick. Caleb watched him. "What is it, boy?" Shadow sniffed along the base of the chimney again, then pawed lightly at the ground beside it. The sound of claw against soil echoed faintly inside the empty foundation. Caleb crouched down and brushed away a small layer of dirt with his hand. Beneath the soil, he could see a narrow opening in the brickwork. An old flue passage, part of the chimney's original design. Shadow wagged his tail slowly. The wind picked up across the prairie. Caleb stood again and looked around the burnt foundation one more time. A ruin, everyone had called it. A mistake. But the chimney stood straight, strong, unbroken. Shadow sat beside it, staring up the tall brick column that disappeared into the bright Wyoming sky. Caleb followed the dog's gaze. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then Caleb said quietly, almost to himself, "Maybe they're wrong." Shadow thumped his tail once against the dirt. Far away, the mountains waited beneath a gathering band of clouds. Winter was already on its way. And for the first time since arriving in Red Hollow, Caleb Walker felt the smallest spark of something he hadn't felt in a long time. Possibility. The wind moved across the empty prairie, brushing through the tall grass with a dry whisper. Caleb stood inside the burnt foundation and looked up at the chimney again. 30 feet of red brick rose into the pale Wyoming sky, stubborn and unmoved by the years of storms that had passed since the fire. Shadow circled it slowly, nose low to the ground. Caleb watched the dog for a moment before turning his gaze toward the mountains in the distance. The Wind River Range looked peaceful from far away, their snow-covered peaks glowing softly under the afternoon sun. But Caleb knew better than to trust quiet landscapes. Quiet places could still hold memories, sometimes too many. He climbed back into the truck and drove toward town again as the sun began to dip lower in the sky. Red Hollow looked even smaller in the evening light. A few porch lamps flickered on along the main street, and the smell of wood smoke drifted through the cold air. Caleb parked beside the small white farmhouse where Mrs. Ruth Carter lived. The woman stood on her porch when he pulled in, wrapped in a thick wool sweater with her gray hair tied loosely behind her head. "Well," she called gently, "did you see the place you bought?" Caleb stepped out of the truck. "Yes, ma'am." "And?" He glanced down at Shadow before answering. "It's something." Mrs. Carter chuckled softly. "That's a polite way of putting it." Shadow trotted up the porch steps and sat beside her rocking chair like he had known the place his whole life. Mrs. Carter reached down and scratched behind the dog's ear. "He's a good one," she said. "He saved my life once," Caleb replied quietly. She studied him for a moment. "War?" Caleb nodded. The word hung in the cold air between them. Mrs. Carter didn't ask for details. People in small towns understood that some questions were better left alone. "You two can stay in the barn again tonight," she said. "Weather's supposed to drop below freezing." "Thank you," Caleb said. The barn sat behind the house, a wide wooden structure that smelled of hay and old leather. Caleb spread his sleeping bag in the corner, while Shadow curled beside him on the straw-covered floor. Outside, the wind picked up. It pushed against the barn walls with a long, hollow sound that echoed through the rafters. Caleb lay staring at the ceiling. For a while, he listened only to the wind. Then sleep came, and with it, the memories. In his dream, the wind turned into something else. Helicopter blades. The dry Wyoming grass became desert sand. Voices shouted through the air. Then the explosion came. A flash of light, heat, dust filling his lungs. Caleb jerked awake with a sharp gasp. The barn was dark except for a faint strip of moonlight slipping through the wooden slats. His heart pounded hard in his chest. For a moment, he didn't know where he was. Then something warm pressed gently against his arm. Shadow. The dog had already lifted his head. Without making a sound, Shadow placed one heavy paw across Caleb's chest and rested his chin against the man's shoulder. The steady weight of the dog pulled Caleb back to the present. No desert. No explosions. Just the quiet barn and the cold Wyoming night. Caleb reached up and ran his hand through Shadow's thick fur. "Easy, boy," he whispered. Shadow's tail thumped softly against the hay. The dog stayed there until Caleb's breathing slowed again. Morning came cold and pale. Frost covered the grass around the barn like a thin sheet of glass. Caleb stepped outside with a mug of coffee Mrs. Carter had left on the porch rail. Shadow trotted beside him, breath steaming in the air. Across the valley, smoke rose from a handful of ranch houses as people lit their morning stoves. Caleb watched the smoke for a long time. Every one of those homes had wood stacked outside. Large piles, tall enough to last through the winter. He thought about what Hank Dawson had said. 8 cords of firewood. That was what a normal house needed. Caleb had barely half a cord in the truck bed. And winter hadn't even started yet. Mrs. Carter came out onto the porch with a small metal bucket. "You heading back to that foundation today?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am." She nodded toward the dog. "You'd better take him with you." Shadow barked once, as if agreeing. Caleb finished his coffee and climbed into the truck. The drive north felt longer that morning. Gray clouds gathered over the mountains, and the wind had grown stronger overnight. When Caleb reached the burnt foundation again, Shadow jumped out of the truck before the engine even stopped. The dog ran straight toward the chimney. His nose moved along the base of the brick like he had unfinished business there. Caleb walked slowly across the dark soil inside the foundation. He knelt beside Shadow and brushed more dirt away from the small opening the dog had found the day before. The flue passage ran deeper than he expected. Caleb leaned closer. Cold air drifted out from inside the brick. Shadow pawed at the ground again, scratching harder this time. A chunk of loose dirt slid away, then another. Caleb frowned slightly. "Hold on," he murmured. He grabbed a broken board from the edge of the foundation and used it to scrape the soil aside. The hole widened. Beneath the surface, a narrow tunnel of brick extended into the chimney's base. It was one of the original smoke channels that once fed the central stack. Shadow barked once and wagged his tail. Caleb stared at the opening for a long moment. The wind howled across the prairie again, but inside the stone foundation the sound felt quieter, sheltered, protected. Caleb stood slowly and looked around the rectangle of blackened stones. Then he looked back at the chimney, and the idea came to him like a sudden flash. He didn't say anything at first. He just studied the space again, measured it with his eyes. The stone walls were thick. The ground inside the foundation was slightly lower than the surrounding prairie. If the floor went deeper, if the earth itself blocked the wind. Caleb exhaled slowly. Shadow tilted his head, watching him. "You see it too, don't you?" Caleb said quietly. The dog wagged his tail again. Caleb walked to the truck and pulled out a shovel. The metal blades scraped loudly as it struck the frozen soil. Shadow immediately began digging beside him, flinging dirt behind him with powerful kicks of his back legs. Caleb laughed softly under his breath. "All right," he said. "Let's see what this place really is." Above them, the tall chimney stood silent against the sky. And far away in the mountains, winter continued its slow march toward Red Hollow. The wind moved steadily across the prairie, carrying the faint smell of dry grass and cold earth. Caleb Walker leaned into the shovel again, driving the blade into the soil beside the chimney's base. The ground here was packed firm, but not impossible. Each strike made a dull thud. Shadow worked beside him with tireless energy, kicking dirt backward in short bursts as his claws scraped through the loose top layer. The dog paused only long enough to sniff the ground again before digging harder. Caleb wiped sweat from his forehead with the sleeve of his jacket. "You're serious about this, huh?" he muttered. Shadow gave a short bark and kept digging. For the next hour, the two of them worked without speaking. Dirt slowly piled along the inside edges of the burnt foundation. The shallow hole widened and deepened inch by inch. The wind hummed across the empty prairie. At one point, Caleb stopped and stood upright, resting both hands on the shovel handle as he studied the chimney again. The structure was thicker at the base than he had first realized, nearly 6 feet across. thousands of bricks stacked one upon another, strong enough to survive the fire that destroyed everything else. Shadow suddenly froze. His ears shot forward. The dog scratched harder at a spot near the edge of the chimney's foundation. "Hold on," Caleb said, stepping closer. Shadow pawed at the ground twice more. Then the soil shifted. A clump of dirt collapsed inward with a soft crunch. Beneath it appeared a narrow brick arch. Caleb knelt immediately and brushed away the loose soil with both hands. As the dirt cleared, a rectangular opening revealed itself, one of the old smoke passages feeding into the chimney. The flue tunnel stretched inward into darkness. Caleb leaned closer, peering inside. Cool air drifted out from the passage. Shadow pushed his nose toward the opening and sniffed deeply. "Easy," Caleb murmured. The dog backed away but remained alert, watching Caleb carefully. Caleb ran his hand along the bricks. They were solid, still tightly mortared even after years of exposure. "This thing was built right," he said quietly. The passage was just wide enough for smoke to travel through, maybe 12 inches across. Caleb followed the line of brickwork with his eyes and realized there had likely been several of these channels connected to fireplaces in the original house. A central heating chimney. Large, efficient, built to warm a full structure. Caleb sat back on his heels. The idea forming in his mind suddenly sharpened. He looked around the empty foundation again. 24 feet wide, 30 feet long. Stone walls thick enough to block wind. And the ground inside already sat lower than the surrounding prairie. Shadow wagged his tail slowly, as if sensing the shift in Caleb's thinking. "You see it, don't you?" Caleb said. Shadow tilted his head. Caleb stood and paced slowly around the inside of the foundation. "If the walls stay," he said quietly, thinking out loud, "and the floor goes down." The wind swept across the grass again. Then the ground itself blocks the wind. He stopped beside the chimney. "And if the chimney heats up?" Caleb pressed his palm against the brick again. Cold for now, but brick was different from iron. Iron heated quickly, but cooled just as fast. Brick held heat, stored it, released it slowly. He had seen something similar once overseas, years earlier, during a brief training exchange with European engineers. Old stone stoves, mass heaters, burn hot for a short time, then radiate warmth for hours. Caleb looked down at the flue opening Shadow had uncovered. "What if we don't build a house above ground at all?" Shadow's ears twitched. Caleb crouched again and widened the opening slightly, clearing away more dirt. The passage bent inward toward the chimney's center. Smoke had once traveled this route upward through the brick stack, but it could still carry heat. Heat into the chimney. Heat stored in the bricks. Caleb exhaled slowly. "Maybe they're wrong," he said again. Shadow barked once. The sound echoed softly against the stone walls. They worked for another hour. The hole grew deeper until Caleb could stand nearly a foot below the original ground level inside the foundation. Already the wind felt weaker down there, sheltered. The prairie wind slid across the top stones, but barely touched the lower space. Caleb climbed out of the hole and looked across the valley. Clouds had thickened over the mountains. The sun was fading toward late afternoon. Winter was closer than it looked. "Let's head back," he said. Shadow followed him to the truck, though the dog paused once more beside the chimney before leaving. He sniffed the brick again, pressing his nose against the mortar line as if memorizing the scent. Then he jumped into the truck. Back in Red Hollow, the evening had settled into its usual quiet rhythm. Lights glowed inside the diner on the corner, and smoke rose steadily from the chimneys of the small houses. Caleb stepped into the general store to buy a loaf of bread and a can of soup. The two men from the courthouse the day before sat near the window playing cards. They looked up when Caleb walked in. "Hey," one of them said. "That the guy who bought the burnt place?" The other chuckled. "That foundation's been empty 8 years." Caleb said nothing as he paid for the food. The clerk bagged the items slowly. "You planning to build something out there?" the man asked. Caleb shrugged. "Maybe." The card player laughed. "Hope you like frostbite." His friend added, 40 below hits hard out there." Caleb picked up the bag and turned toward the door. The bell jingled softly as he left. Outside, Shadow waited patiently beside the truck. Caleb climbed in and started the engine. The dog looked at him. "You know," Caleb said, glancing toward the north road, "they might be right." Shadow blinked slowly. Caleb drove back to Mrs. Carter's barn in silence. That night, long after the lights in the farmhouse had gone out, Caleb sat awake on the hay-covered floor of the barn. The lantern beside him cast a small circle of light. In front of him lay a rough sketch he had drawn on the back of an old receipt. A rectangle, a chimney in the center, lines showing a pit dug downward, a small stove feeding heat into the flue. He studied the drawing again and again. Shadow lay nearby, watching quietly. Finally, Caleb folded the paper. "We're going to dig," he said. Shadow's tail thumped softly against the hay. Outside, the wind howled across the Wyoming valley. And far beyond the mountains, the first true storms of winter were already forming. Morning arrived gray and cold. The frost along Mrs. Carter's fence glittered in the weak sunlight as Caleb Walker loaded the shovel, a rusted pickaxe, and a coil of rope into the bed of his truck. Shadow jumped in beside the tools, tail swishing once before settling down. Mrs. Carter stepped out onto her porch with a mug of coffee in her hands. "You headed back out there?" she asked. Caleb nodded. "Yes, ma'am." She watched him quietly for a moment. "That place is a long way from help if the weather turns." "I know." Her eyes moved to the dog. "Well," she said softly, "at least you've got the right partner." Shadow barked once, as if in agreement. The drive north took nearly 30 minutes over rutted dirt roads and open stretches of prairie. The sky hung low with thin clouds that moved quickly across the mountains. When Caleb pulled up beside the burnt foundation again, the chimney looked even taller against the dull morning sky. Shadow jumped down and immediately ran to the same spot beside the brick base. Caleb grabbed the shovel. "All right," he muttered. "Let's start." The first few hours were nothing but work. The shovel bit into the soil again and again, each strike loosening another layer of packed earth. Dirt piled along the inner stone walls of the old foundation. Shadow dug beside him with relentless determination, throwing clumps of soil behind him like a small excavation machine. By midday, the hole inside the foundation had grown nearly 2 feet deep. Already the wind felt weaker down there. Caleb climbed down into the pit and stood still for a moment. The stone walls now rose above him like a low barrier. The prairie wind rushed overhead, but down in the pit, the air was calm. Shadow jumped in beside him and wagged his tail proudly. Caleb looked around slowly. "Not bad," he said. Shadow barked once. Caleb leaned on the shovel, thinking. The chimney stood directly in the center of the pit, massive and silent. If he dug deeper, if he built a roof low across the top, if the stove fed heat into the chimney through the flue, the brick could store the warmth. Not just for minutes, for hours, maybe longer.
The sound of an approaching engine drifted across the prairie. Caleb climbed out of the pit just as a dusty pickup rolled to a stop near the road. Hank Dawson stepped out. The rancher walked slowly toward the foundation, hands in the pockets of his denim jacket. He stopped at the edge of the stones and looked down into the pit.
"Well, I'll be," he muttered. "You really are digging." Caleb wiped dirt from his hands. "Looks that way." Hank studied the hole for a long moment. Then he shook his head. "Son, that ain't a house." "It's a start." Hank stepped down into the foundation and walked around the pit carefully. Shadow followed him closely, watching every step. "You planning to bury yourself?" Hank asked. Caleb pointed toward the chimney.
"No."
Hank frowned. "You can't build walls before winter. Not out here."
"I'm not building walls."
Hank stared at him. Caleb continued calmly.
"I'm building down."
The rancher scratched his beard. "That doesn't change the math."
"What math?"
"The wood math." Hank pointed toward the distant hills. "A man burns 8 cords of wood to get through a Wyoming winter." He pointed to the small pile of branches Caleb had gathered beside the truck. "You've got maybe 1. Caleb nodded slowly.
"I know."
"Then you're dead by January." Caleb walked to the chimney and placed his hand against the brick.
"Not if I'm not heating the house."
Hank frowned. "What are you heating then?" Caleb tapped the brick with his knuckles.
"This."
The sound echoed hollowly through the chimney stack. Hank stared at him. "You're serious?"
Caleb nodded. "The stove will heat the chimney. The bricks store the heat."
Hank let out a quiet laugh. "You're telling me that tower is going to keep you alive at 40 below?" Caleb shrugged.
"I think it might."
Hank climbed out of the foundation slowly and looked around the empty prairie. The wind pushed the tall grass flat in long silver waves. "You know," Hank said finally, "I've lived here 30 years. Caleb waited. "And every year somebody comes along with a clever idea about beating winter." Hank glanced back at the pit. "Winter usually wins." Caleb didn't argue. Hank walked toward his truck but paused halfway. "For what it's worth," the rancher added, "you and that dog are welcome to haul water from my well if you need it." Caleb nodded. "Thank you." Hank climbed back into his truck and drove away, leaving a trail of dust drifting across the prairie. Shadow watched until the truck disappeared. Then he turned and jumped back into the pit. Caleb laughed softly. "Yeah," he said. "I guess we're doing this." The afternoon passed slowly. The pit deepened. 3 feet, then 4. By sunset, the stone walls rose nearly to Caleb's chest when he stood inside. The wind barely touched the bottom anymore. Shadow jumped out of the pit and ran in a wide circle around the foundation before returning to Caleb's side. Caleb climbed out and looked at the work they had done. A shallow underground room had begun to take shape, and in its center stood the chimney. The last light of the sun struck the red brick, turning it gold for a moment before fading. Caleb leaned against the stone wall, breathing slowly. The idea still sounded crazy, even to him. But something about the chimney refused to leave his mind. Shadow sat beside him, panting lightly after the long day. "You still think this will work?" Caleb asked. The dog wagged his tail. The wind picked up again as darkness settled over the valley. Far away, thunder rolled faintly over the mountains. The first winter storm was moving closer. And for the first time since buying the ruined land, Caleb Walker realized something important.
There was no turning back now. The wind rolled across the Wyoming prairie like a long warning. Caleb stood beside the burnt foundation as the sky dimmed toward evening. The clouds above the Wind River Range had thickened into a dull gray sheet, and the temperature had already begun dropping fast. Winter was getting closer. Shadow trotted around the edge of the foundation one more time before settling near the pit Caleb had dug earlier that day.
The dog lowered himself beside the stone wall and watched Caleb with patient eyes. "You ready for this?" Caleb asked quietly. Shadow wagged his tail once. The next morning began before sunrise. The air bit sharply against Caleb's lungs when he stepped out of Mrs. Carter's barn. Frost coated the ground so thick it looked like a thin blanket of snow. Caleb loaded the shovel, pickaxe, and a bundle of salvaged boards he had collected from an abandoned shed outside town. Shadow jumped into the truck without hesitation. By the time the truck reached the burnt foundation, the eastern sky had begun glowing pale gold behind the mountains. The chimney rose from the center of the ruin exactly as it had the day before, tall, silent, and stubborn. Caleb grabbed the shovel. "Let's go to work." The digging began again. Hour after hour, each swing of the shovel drove deeper into the packed prairie soil. The pit slowly widened until Caleb could walk around the chimney comfortably inside the excavation. Shadow never stopped helping. The dog dug furiously beside Caleb, flinging dirt behind him with powerful kicks of his back legs. Sometimes he carried loose sticks or stones out of the hole, dropping them outside the foundation before racing back in to continue. By mid-morning, the pit had reached nearly 4 feet deep. Down there, the air felt different. The prairie wind screamed across the open land above them, but inside the pit, the sound softened to a low whisper. Caleb paused and leaned against the shovel. "Feel that?" he said. Shadow tilted his head. "Wind can't reach us down here." The dog barked once. Caleb looked around the pit again. Stone walls above, packed earth below, and the chimney standing solid in the center. If he dug just a little deeper, he struck the shovel into the ground again. The work continued through the afternoon. Dirt piled higher around the edges of the foundation. Shadow's paws were covered with dust and mud by the time the sun began sliding toward the mountains. Then suddenly, a sharp crack echoed through the pit. Caleb froze. Shadow barked and jumped back. A loose chunk of old brick had shifted near the chimney's base. The stone dropped suddenly into the pit and shattered against the dirt floor. Caleb rushed forward. "Shadow!" The dog had been digging inches away from the falling brick. For a terrifying moment, Caleb thought the brick had struck the dog's leg. Shadow limped once, then shook himself and stood straight again. Caleb knelt beside him quickly, running his hands along the dog's legs. "You all right?" Shadow wagged his tail weakly. A small scrape showed along the dog's front paw where the brick had grazed him. Nothing broken, but close. Too close. Caleb sat back on the dirt floor and exhaled slowly. "Easy, boy," he murmured. Shadow leaned into him, resting his head against Caleb's shoulder. For a moment, neither of them moved. The prairie wind roared above the pit again. Caleb looked up at the chimney. The structure was strong, but the old flue bricks around the base had weakened with time. "We've got to be careful," Caleb said softly. Shadow licked his hand. After a short rest, Caleb climbed out of the pit and grabbed a small first aid kit from the truck. He cleaned the scrape on Shadow's paw and wrapped it lightly with a strip of cloth. "There," he said. "You're still on duty." Shadow wagged his tail again. The sun had nearly disappeared when Caleb finally stopped digging for the day. The pit now reached nearly 5 feet deep.
Standing inside it, the stone foundation rose above Caleb's shoulders. The wind barely touched the bottom anymore. For the first time, the space actually felt like a room. Caleb climbed out slowly and stretched his aching back. The sky had turned orange behind the mountains. Shadow limped slightly, but followed him to the edge of the foundation.
Caleb studied the work carefully. "This could work," he whispered. But there was still more to do. A roof, a stove, and enough wood to survive the coming storms. That night, back at Mrs. Carter's barn, Caleb sat beside the lantern again with his sketch. He added new lines to the drawing. A low wooden roof, layers of dirt packed over the top, the stovepipe feeding heat directly into the chimney flue. Shadow lay nearby with his bandaged paw resting on the hay. Every so often, the dog lifted his head and looked toward Caleb. "You saved us a lot of digging today," Caleb said quietly. Shadow's tail thumped once. The lantern flickered softly in the dark barn. Outside, the wind continued pushing across the valley. And far beyond the mountains, the first real winter storm had already begun forming its long march toward Red Hollow. Morning came colder than the day before. A thin sheet of ice had formed across the shallow water trough beside Mrs. Carter's barn. Caleb Walker cracked it with the heel of his boot before filling a small jug for the drive north. Shadow stood beside the truck, his bandaged paw lifted slightly off the ground, but his posture just as steady as ever. "You sure you're up for another day?" Caleb asked. Shadow wagged his tail. That was answer enough. The road out of Red Hollow looked different that morning. The sky had turned a pale steel color, and a long line of clouds stretched across the western horizon like a warning written in the sky. Winter was no longer coming. It was arriving. When Caleb reached the burnt foundation, the prairie looked quieter than usual. The wind had softened, but the cold had sharpened. The tall chimney stood against the sky exactly as it had every day before, unmoving, patient. Shadow jumped down from the truck and limped slightly toward the pit. Caleb followed with the shovel. The excavation they had dug over the past several days now looked like a real underground room. Nearly 5 feet deep, the stone walls rose high enough that the prairie wind no longer touched the bottom. Caleb climbed down inside and looked around slowly. "Feels different down here," he said. Shadow jumped into the pit beside him and circled the chimney. The dog's nose brushed along the base bricks again, just as it had the first day. Caleb reached into the truck and pulled out something new. An old iron stove. The small cast-iron box was scratched and rusted, but the hinges still worked and the fire chamber remained solid. He had found it behind an abandoned shed outside town the night before. It wasn't pretty, but it would burn wood, and that was enough. Caleb lowered the stove carefully into the pit, using the rope tied to the truck's bumper. Shadow watched the whole process like a supervisor, pacing slowly around the edge of the hole. Once the stove sat firmly on the dirt floor, Caleb crouched beside the chimney's flue opening. The narrow brick tunnel Shadow had uncovered now looked like a doorway into the chimney's hidden interior. Caleb fitted a short section of rusted stovepipe into the opening. It took several tries to angle it correctly, but eventually the pipe slid into place. He stepped back and looked at the arrangement. The stovepipe ran directly from the iron stove into the chimney's lower flue. The chimney would carry smoke upward. But before the smoke left, the heat would pass through the bricks. Caleb wiped dirt from his hands. "Well," he said quietly, "this is the moment." Shadow sat down beside him. Caleb gathered a handful of dry twigs and small branches from the pile he had collected earlier.
He opened the stove door and stacked the wood carefully. A scrap of newspaper served as kindling. Caleb struck a match. For a moment, the tiny flame flickered weakly in the cold air. Then the paper caught. The twigs snapped softly as fire spread through them. Smoke curled slowly upward through the stovepipe.
Shadow leaned forward, watching the flame dance behind the small iron door. Caleb fed a few thicker sticks into the fire. The stove began to glow faintly with warmth. Minutes passed. Then 20. Then 40. At first, nothing seemed to change. The pit remained cold. The air still carried the bite of early winter. Caleb leaned back against the stone wall. "Maybe Hank was right," he muttered. Shadow lifted his head. The dog walked toward the chimney and sniffed the brick carefully. Then he barked once. Caleb frowned and stood. He walked toward the chimney and placed his hand against the brick. It felt different. Not hot, but no longer cold. The warmth had begun spreading slowly through the masonry. Caleb waited. Another hour passed. The fire burned steadily inside the stove. And slowly, almost too slowly to notice, the chimney began to warm. The bricks held the heat like a sponge absorbing water. Shadow stretched out on the dirt floor beside the chimney. The dog's body relaxed. Caleb leaned closer and placed both hands against the brick. Warm. Not just near the flue, across the entire column. The heat had begun spreading upward through the chimney. Caleb sat back, watching carefully. Another hour passed. The fire inside the stove finally died down to glowing coals. The pit fell quiet again. The wind howled above the foundation walls. But inside the pit, something had changed. Caleb noticed it first in the air. It no longer stung his lungs. The temperature had risen. Slowly, quietly. The chimney continued radiating warmth long after the fire had faded. Caleb looked at Shadow. "You feel that?" Shadow's tail thumped against the dirt. The dog curled closer to the chimney and rested his head on his paws. Nearly an hour later, the bricks were still warm. Caleb laughed softly under his breath. "That's it," he whispered. "That's exactly it." The chimney wasn't just venting the fire. It was storing it, holding the heat inside thousands of bricks, and releasing it slowly. Caleb climbed out of the pit and looked across the prairie. The sky had darkened toward evening. Far in the distance, a line of snow clouds rolled down the mountains like a silent army. He knew what that meant. Within days, the first real winter storm would arrive. But when Caleb climbed back down into the pit, the warmth from the chimney still filled the air around him. Not blazing hot, but steady, comfortable. Shadow had already fallen asleep beside the brick column. The dog's chest rose and fell slowly, his body relaxed in the gentle heat. Caleb sat beside him and leaned against the stone wall. For the first time since arriving in Red Hollow, he wasn't thinking about surviving the winter. He was thinking about winning it. For a long moment, Caleb Walker simply sat there beside the chimney, feeling the steady warmth flowing from the brick. Outside, the wind swept across the Wyoming prairie with its usual restless sound, rattling the dry grass and whispering through the broken edges of the old foundation. But down inside the pit, the air had softened. It wasn't summer warmth, not even spring, but it was enough. Enough that his fingers no longer ached. Enough that his breath no longer hung in thick white clouds. Enough to make Shadow stretch his body out comfortably on the dirt floor, his tail slowly thumping against the ground. Caleb ran a hand through the dog's thick fur. "You figured it out before I did," he murmured. Shadow lifted his head slightly, ears twitching. Then the dog rested his chin back on his paws, content. Above them, the chimney stood like a watchtower over the ruined foundation. And for the first time, Caleb understood what that chimney had once been. Not just part of a house, the heart of it. The center that had once kept an entire family warm through Wyoming winters. And now, somehow, it had chosen him. The sun had nearly disappeared behind the mountains when Caleb finally climbed out of the pit. The air outside bit at his face immediately. Cold, sharp. The temperature had dropped faster than he expected. He walked toward the truck and checked the thermometer hanging from the rearview mirror. 21 degrees, and falling. Caleb looked back toward the pit where Shadow still rested beside the chimney. Winter was moving faster now. He could feel it in the air. Feel it in the way the sky had turned a dull gray that stretched endlessly across the valley. The first snow would not be far behind, and the small bunker they had built still wasn't finished. Caleb climbed back down into the pit. "All right, partner," he said. "Time to make this place real." Shadow stood immediately. The dog's injured paw still caused a slight limp, but he moved with the same determination as always. The next few days passed in a blur of work. Caleb cut fallen timber from the edge of the valley and dragged it back to the property using the truck. He trimmed the logs into rough beams and built a low wooden frame across the top of the pit. Shadow helped in the only way a dog could. He dragged small branches, carried tools when Caleb dropped them, and stayed close whenever the wind picked up hard enough to shake the prairie. Once the frame was finished, Caleb covered it with scrap boards scavenged from an abandoned barn outside town. Then came the most important step: insulation. Caleb shoveled dirt back over the wooden roof until the entire structure was buried beneath nearly 2 feet of earth. From above, the place looked almost invisible now. Just a patch of disturbed soil inside the old burned foundation, and the tall chimney rising out of it like a lone monument. The bunker beneath it had become something else: a shelter. Inside, the difference was dramatic. The dirt walls trapped the heat. The earth above the roof blocked the worst of the wind. And every evening, Caleb lit the stove for 2 hours. Just 2. That was enough. The chimney absorbed the heat and released it slowly through the night. By morning, the air inside still carried a soft warmth. Caleb kept checking it, half expecting the system to fail. But every night the result was the same. It worked. Meanwhile, the rest of Red Hollow prepared for winter in the way it always had. Huge stacks of firewood appeared outside every farmhouse, tall enough to look like wooden walls. Men spent entire days splitting logs and hauling them into barns. Smoke rose from chimneys across the valley from morning until night. When Caleb drove into town for supplies, he noticed people watching him again. Not laughing this time, just watching. At the general store, Hank Dawson leaned against the counter as Caleb carried a sack of potatoes toward the register. "You still out there in that hole?" Hank asked. Caleb nodded. "Yep." Hank scratched his beard slowly. "And you think that little stove's gonna keep you alive come January?" Caleb paused before answering. "I don't think," he said. "I know." Hank studied him for a long moment. Then he shook his head and laughed softly. "Well," he said, "you're either the smartest man in Wyoming or the first fool to freeze solid underground." Caleb smiled slightly. "Guess we'll find out." That night, the wind arrived. Not the usual breeze that wandered through the valley. This wind carried the mountains with it. Cold air poured down from the Wind River range like a river of ice. The temperature dropped below 15 degrees before midnight. Inside the bunker, Caleb sat beside the stove while Shadow lay against the warm bricks of the chimney. The fire had already burned down to coals, yet the heat remained. Caleb stretched his legs toward the brick column. The warmth still radiated steadily. Shadow shifted closer and rested his head against Caleb's boot. Outside, the wind screamed across the prairie. Above them, snow clouds rolled silently across the Wyoming sky. And somewhere far in the mountains, the first true blizzard of the season had already begun forming. Its long shadow was slowly moving toward Red Hollow. Caleb leaned his head back against the dirt wall. For the first time since the war, for the first time in years, he felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Control. Not over everything, but over this. Over the small shelter they had carved from the earth. Over the warmth stored inside the ancient chimney. And over the winter that was coming. Shadow's ears twitched suddenly. The dog lifted his head and stared toward the bunker's entrance. Caleb listened carefully. At first he heard only the wind. Then something else. A faint sound drifting down from the prairie above. Soft, almost like sand brushing across wood. Snow. The first flakes of the season had begun to fall over Red Hollow. Caleb stood and walked to the small hatch at the top of the bunker. He pushed it open slowly. Cold air rushed inside. Under the pale moonlight, tiny white flakes drifted through the sky. The Wyoming winter had arrived. Caleb looked down at Shadow waiting below. "Well," he said quietly, "now we find out if this old chimney really knows what it's doing." Snow drifted down through the Wyoming night like quiet dust falling from the sky. At first it came gently, small flakes that vanished when they touched the ground. But Caleb Walker had lived in the mountains long enough to recognize the warning signs. The air had gone completely still. No wind, no sound. Just that strange silence that always came before something big. He closed the bunker hatch and climbed back down. Shadow watched him carefully, ears alert. Caleb brushed snow from his jacket and fed another log into the iron stove. The fire flared briefly, orange light dancing against the brick chimney. "Looks like winter's officially here," Caleb said. Shadow wagged his tail once. For a while, nothing happened. The bunker remained warm. The chimney continued releasing the heat it had stored earlier that evening. Outside, snow quietly began covering the valley. By midnight, the wind returned. Not gently. It arrived all at once. A deep roar swept across the prairie like a freight train charging through the darkness. The bunker walls trembled slightly as the first true gusts slammed against the buried roof. Snow hissed across the ground above them. Shadow jumped to his feet. Caleb listened. Years in the army had trained him to read danger in sound alone. And this wind carried something heavier. A storm. A real one. The temperature began dropping fast. Within an hour, the outside world had transformed. Snow no longer drifted downward, it flew sideways. The wind hurled white sheets across the prairie, erasing the horizon and swallowing the land in a swirling gray storm. Inside the bunker, Caleb checked the chimney. The bricks remained warm. Not blazing hot, but steady, reliable. Shadow pressed his side against the chimney and sighed softly. For the moment, they were safe. But the storm outside was growing stronger. By dawn, the blizzard had fully arrived. Wind screamed across Red Hollow at nearly 60 miles per hour. Snow piled against barns and fences. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. On the far side of the valley,
Hank Dawson stepped onto his porch and stared into the white storm. He pulled his coat tighter around his neck. The thermometer nailed to the barn wall read -12 degrees, and falling. Hank squinted through the snow toward the north end of the valley, toward the burnt foundation. He shook his head slowly. "No way that boy's still alive out there," he muttered. Back in the bunker, Caleb woke to the sound of something heavy slamming above them. The storm had intensified overnight.
The wind roared like an angry ocean above the buried roof. Snow packed against the hatch, sealing it tighter with every passing minute. Shadow was already awake. The dog stood at the entrance tunnel, listening carefully. Caleb checked the stove. Only coals remained. He added another log and waited for the fire to catch. Outside, the storm grew worse. Another crash shook the bunker roof. A loose board from the old foundation had been ripped free and hurled across the ground above them. Shadow barked once. Caleb stood. "I know," he said quietly. "We're not out of it yet." He climbed the small ladder toward the hatch and pushed it open carefully. The moment the lid lifted, a blast of frozen wind exploded into the bunker. Snow poured down the entrance shaft like sand in a desert storm. Caleb slammed the hatch shut again. Outside was chaos. The wind howled so loudly it sounded like the mountains themselves were screaming. This wasn't a simple snowstorm. It was a Wyoming blizzard, and it had only begun. Hours passed. Caleb kept the stove burning in short bursts, just as his plan required. 2 hours of fire. Then he let the coals fade. The chimney continued releasing heat through the bunker long after the flames died. But sometime late in the afternoon, something unexpected happened. A sudden cracking sound echoed above the bunker. Caleb froze. Then came another noise. A heavy object scraping across the buried roof. The storm had torn something loose from the old foundation. Shadow rushed toward the entrance tunnel, barking sharply. Caleb grabbed his coat. "Stay," he told the dog. But Shadow ignored the command. Caleb opened the hatch again, forcing it upward against the packed snow. Wind exploded inside the bunker. Snow blasted into his face like needles. Through the swirling white storm, Caleb could barely see 10 feet in front of him. But he saw enough. One of the old charred beams from the burnt house had broken loose in the wind. The heavy timber now leaned dangerously against the chimney. If the beam shifted the wrong way, it could collapse part of the structure. Caleb stepped outside, fighting the wind. Snow reached nearly to his knees already. Behind him, Shadow leaped from the bunker and landed beside him in the storm. "Shadow!" Caleb shouted. The dog ignored him again. The German shepherd charged forward through the blizzard toward the fallen beam. The wind howled louder. The beam creaked as another gust slammed against it. If it fell sideways, it could break the chimney's outer brick layer. And without the chimney, the bunker's entire heating system would fail. Caleb struggled forward through the snow, but the wind pushed him sideways. The beam shifted again. Shadow reached it first. The dog braced his body against the lower edge, barking fiercely as if trying to hold the timber in place. "Get back!" Caleb shouted. Another violent gust ripped across the prairie. The beam suddenly slid. Caleb lunged forward. At that exact moment, the timber dropped. Shadow yelped. The heavy wood struck the ground just inches away from the dog. But in the chaos of the storm, Caleb saw something else. Shadow staggered backward. Blood darkened the snow near his shoulder. The beam had clipped him. Caleb rushed forward and pulled the timber aside with all his strength. The dog limped toward him, breathing hard but still standing. "You stubborn idiot," Caleb whispered, kneeling beside him. The wound wasn't fatal, but it was deep. The storm roared around them. Snow buried the ground almost instantly. Caleb lifted Shadow carefully into his arms and carried him back toward the bunker. The dog's head rested against his shoulder. Even injured, Shadow kept his eyes on the chimney behind them, guarding it, protecting it, just like he had from the beginning. Back inside the bunker, Caleb wrapped the dog's shoulder with cloth torn from his own shirt. Shadow lay beside the chimney again, breathing slowly. The warm bricks pressed gently against his side. Outside, the blizzard continued raging across the valley. But inside the buried bunker, the ancient chimney still radiated its steady warmth. And beside it, the wounded German shepherd kept watch over the man he refused to leave. For a long time, neither of them moved. The wind above the bunker roared like a living thing, shaking loose snow down the narrow entrance tunnel and rattling the wooden beams buried under the earth. But inside the small underground room, the heat from the chimney spread slowly through the air. Shadow lay pressed against the warm brick, his breathing slow but steady. The cloth Caleb had tied around the dog's shoulder had already darkened where the wound had bled, but the bleeding had stopped. Caleb sat beside him, one hand resting on the thick fur along the dog's neck. "You didn't have to do that," he whispered. Shadow opened one eye briefly, then closed it again. Outside, the blizzard continued for 2 more days. Snow piled higher against the buried bunker roof. The entrance hatch froze shut under layers of ice and wind-packed drifts. The world beyond their small underground shelter vanished behind a wall of white. But inside, the system Caleb had built continued working. Every few hours he fed the iron stove for a short burn. Flames climbed through the small firebox, sending heat into the stovepipe and up through the hidden flue channels buried inside the chimney. The bricks absorbed it, stored it, released it slowly. Even when the fire died down to ash, the warmth stayed. The bunker never dropped below a tolerable temperature. At night, Caleb would wake suddenly, heart racing from dreams that pulled him back into places he wished he could forget. In those moments, Shadow would lift his head, press his muzzle gently against Caleb's chest, and wait until the shaking stopped. The war had taught Caleb how to survive danger. Shadow had taught him how to survive the quiet afterward. On the 3rd morning, the wind finally began to weaken. The silence that followed felt almost strange. Caleb climbed the ladder toward the frozen hatch. It took several minutes of pushing before the packed snow finally broke loose and the hatch opened with a loud crack. Blinding white light poured into the bunker. Snow stretched across the entire valley like an endless ocean. Drifts nearly 5 feet deep covered the prairie. Fences had disappeared. Small trees bent under the heavy weight of ice. The storm had buried Red Hollow. Caleb stepped carefully onto the surface, boots sinking deep into the powder. The cold air stung his lungs immediately, but the sky above was clear. The storm had finally moved on. Shadow climbed out behind him slowly, favoring his injured shoulder, but determined to follow. Together, they stood beside the tall chimney rising from the snow. The structure had survived. The fallen beam from the storm now lay half-buried nearby, but the chimney itself remained solid and unbroken. Caleb ran his hand across the cold brick. "You held," he said quietly. Shadow wagged his tail weakly. Across the valley, smoke began rising from distant farmhouses again. People were emerging after the storm, digging outdoors, clearing barns, counting what the blizzard had taken. Several hours later, far across the snow-covered prairie, a rider appeared. Hank Dawson urged his horse slowly through the deep drifts, guiding the animal carefully across the frozen land. His coat was pulled tight around his shoulders, and his hat pulled low against the lingering wind. He had spent most of the morning checking neighboring properties. 2 barns had collapsed under the weight of snow. One family had lost nearly half their livestock. And through it all, Hank had been thinking about the young veteran who had bought the burnt foundation for $5. The boy had been stubborn, too stubborn to leave. Hank reached the northern edge of the valley and pulled his horse to a stop. The sight in front of him made him frown. The chimney still stood. Snow covered the old foundation completely, but the brick column remained visible above the drifts, like a marker planted in the frozen earth. Hank stared at it for a moment. "No way," he muttered. He guided the horse closer. The snow was deeper here, making progress slow. When he finally reached the edge of the foundation, he dismounted and walked carefully across the buried ground. "Walker!" he called. No answer. Hank approached the chimney. "Walker!" Then he heard something. A faint scraping sound beneath the snow. Before he could react, a wooden hatch suddenly lifted upward. A cloud of steam-like warmth rose into the cold air. Caleb climbed out. Behind him, shadow followed. For a moment, Hank simply stared. The veteran stood there, covered in dirt and soot, but alive. Very much alive. And beside him, the German shepherd stood watchfully, one shoulder wrapped in cloth, but his eyes sharp and alert. Hank looked from the dog to the chimney, then down toward the open hatch. Warm air drifted upward from the bunker below. "How in God's name?" Hank whispered. Caleb brushed snow from his jacket. "Morning," he said calmly. Hank stepped closer to the hatch and peered down inside. What he saw made him go completely still. The underground room glowed faintly from the stove's dying coals. The brick chimney filled the center of the bunker like a giant pillar, and the air rising from below carried the unmistakable warmth of a heated room. Hank slowly removed his gloves. "You tellin' me," he began. Caleb nodded. 2 hours of fire a day," he said. "The chimney does the rest." Hank looked again at the tall brick column rising above the snow, then back at the underground shelter hidden beneath the burnt foundation. Across the valley, other farms had burned nearly half their winter wood during the 3-day storm. But here, the chimney bunker had barely used any. Hank let out a long breath. "Well," he said quietly, "I'll be damned." Shadow sat proudly beside Caleb, and for the first time since arriving in Red Hollow, someone was no longer laughing at the ruined land. Hank Dawson stood beside the tall chimney, staring down into the open hatch as warm air drifted out into the frozen Wyoming morning. The contrast was almost unreal. All around them the valley looked battered by the storm. Snow covered fences and buried the lower half of barns. Tree branches hung low under heavy frost. Yet from the hole in the ground beneath the burnt foundation, warmth rolled upward like breath from a hidden furnace. Hank scratched his beard slowly. "You're telling me you stayed down there the whole storm?" Caleb nodded. 3 days. "And you didn't burn through half a forest worth of wood?" Caleb shook his head. 2 short fires a day." Hank looked at him like he was trying to decide if the man in front of him had finally gone crazy. Then he crouched near the hatch and climbed carefully down the ladder.
Shadow watched him closely but didn't move. Inside the bunker, Hank stood still for a moment. The air inside felt comfortable. Not hot, but steady. Warm enough that his breath didn't fog the air. His eyes moved slowly across the underground room. The dirt walls, the low wooden ceiling buried beneath layers of earth, and the chimney rising like a stone pillar through the center. Hank walked toward it and pressed his palm against the brick. The warmth surprised him. "That thing's been holding heat this whole time?" he asked. Caleb leaned against the wall. "Brick holds energy," he said quietly. "It absorbs heat slowly, but it releases it slowly too." Hank nodded. He'd grown up around wood stoves his entire life. But this was different. "How long does it stay warm?" he asked. 6 hours, sometimes 8. Hank looked back at the stove. "So you burn wood just long enough to heat the bricks?" Caleb nodded. "Exactly. And after that, the chimney becomes the heater." Caleb gave a small smile. "That's the idea." Hank let out a low whistle. "Well, I'll be damned." He climbed back up into the bright snow light and stood beside the chimney again. For a long time, he didn't say anything. The valley around them remained quiet in the aftermath of the storm. In the distance, farmers moved slowly across the snow, clearing paths to their barns. A few columns of smoke rose weakly into the sky. But most of the valley looked exhausted. The storm had taken a toll. Finally, Hank turned back toward Caleb. "You know what the worst part of that storm was?" Caleb shrugged. "Wood," Hank said. "Everybody burned through nearly half their stacks." He pointed toward the chimney. "And you're telling me you still got most of yours?" Caleb nodded. "More than half." Hank laughed once under his breath. "Well, that's something." He walked slowly around the foundation, studying the chimney from every angle. Then he said something Caleb hadn't expected. "You mind if I bring a couple folks up here tomorrow?" Caleb looked at him. "For what?" Hank shrugged. "To show them." Caleb frowned slightly. "You really think they'll believe it?" Hank smiled. "They're Wyoming people. They believe what they can see." The next afternoon, 3 trucks rolled slowly across the snow-covered prairie toward the burnt foundation. Word traveled fast in a small town. By the time the vehicle stopped near the chimney, 6 people stepped out. Farmers. Neighbors.
People who had stood in the auction yard weeks earlier, laughing at the man who had paid $5 for a burned-out ruin. Now they stood silently around the chimney. Hank gestured toward the hatch. "Go on," he said. "Take a look." One by one, they climbed down the ladder. Inside the bunker, the reaction was the same each time. First, confusion, then silence, then disbelief. "How warm is it down here?" one of them asked. Caleb shrugged. "Depends how long the chimney's been heating." Another farmer pressed his hand against the bricks. "Feels like a radiator." "That's basically what it is," Caleb said. When the last man climbed back out, they all stood in the snow staring at the chimney again. The same chimney they had once laughed at. Now it looked different. Less like the last piece of a burned house, more like the heart of something new. One of the older farmers finally spoke. "You figure this could work in a regular house?" Caleb nodded slowly. "Sure. Build brick around the stove. Let the masonry store the heat. Same principle." The man rubbed his chin thoughtfully. Another farmer asked, How much wood you saving doing it this way? Caleb answered honestly. Probably half. The group fell silent again. Across the valley, winter still held the land in its frozen grip. More storms would come. Everyone in Red Hollow knew that. And suddenly, the chimney standing above the burnt foundation looked less like a joke and more like a solution. Before they left, one of the farmers walked over to Shadow. The dog sat calmly beside the chimney, his injured shoulder still wrapped in cloth. The man crouched and gently scratched behind the dog's ear. "He the one that found it?" he asked. Caleb nodded. "Yeah." The man smiled. "Smart dog." Shadow wagged his tail once. By evening, the trucks disappeared back down the snowy road toward town. Caleb and Shadow stood alone again beside the chimney. But something had changed. For the first time since Caleb arrived in Red Hollow, the valley was no longer looking at the ruined land with mockery. They were looking at it with curiosity. And in the quiet, fading light of the Wyoming winter, the tall chimney stood like a quiet teacher waiting for the rest of the valley to catch up. Over the next few days, Red Hollow began to change. At first, it happened quietly. A truck would appear on the snowy road leading to the burnt foundation. A farmer would step out, walk slowly around the chimney, and study it like a puzzle. Some climbed down into the bunker. Others simply stood outside, staring at the brick column that had somehow defeated the first real storm of the season. Caleb never tried to sell the idea. He simply explained what he had done. Short fires, brick to hold heat, earth to trap warmth, nothing complicated. But in a valley where every winter meant a fight against freezing temperatures and empty wood piles, even a simple idea could spread quickly. Within a week, Hank Dawson had already started rebuilding the fireplace inside his own farmhouse. Not replacing it, expanding it. He lined the walls around his stove with extra brick and stone. "You might be onto something, Walker," Hank admitted one afternoon while standing beside the chimney. Caleb shrugged. "Wasn't really my idea." Hank nodded toward Shadow. "Yeah," he said with a grin. "I know." Shadow sat proudly beside the chimney, tail swishing slowly across the snow. The bandage around his shoulder had been replaced several times, and the wound was healing well, though the dog now walked with a faint limp that would likely stay with him for the rest of his life. But the injury hadn't slowed him down. If anything, it made him more determined to stay close to Caleb. Whenever visitors arrived, Shadow watched them carefully, always placing himself between Caleb and strangers until he decided they meant no harm. The dog had become something of a legend in Red Hollow. Children in town had started calling him the Chimney Dog. Caleb heard the nickname one afternoon while buying supplies at the general store. Two boys stood near the door, whispering excitedly. "That's him," one said quietly. "The dog that found the chimney bunker." Shadow glanced at them briefly, then returned his attention to the doorway like a soldier standing guard. Caleb chuckled softly. "You're getting famous," he told the dog. Winter continued tightening its grip on the valley. More storms came, not as violent as the first blizzard, but strong enough to remind everyone that Wyoming winters were never gentle. Yet something strange began happening across Red Hollow. People started using less wood. Small changes appeared in barns and homes. Extra brick walls near stoves. Stone hearths widened and reinforced. A few farmers even dug shallow underground rooms beside their houses after hearing about Caleb's bunker. Everywhere the same idea spread. Store heat. Don't just burn it. Hank visited often. Sometimes he brought extra supplies. Sometimes he just sat beside the chimney talking while Shadow rested nearby. One evening, as the sun sank behind the mountains and painted the snow-covered valley gold, Hank studied the tall brick column again. "You know," he said slowly, "when you bought this place, folks thought you'd lost your mind." Caleb smiled faintly. "Some still do." Hank laughed. "Not anymore." He gestured toward the valley. "Word's spreading outside Red Hollow now." Caleb raised an eyebrow. "How far?" "Couple ranchers from the next county already came by asking about it." Hank kicked lightly at the snow. "You might have started something bigger than you think." Caleb looked at the chimney. The bricks glowed softly in the fading sunlight. When he had first arrived, this place had been nothing more than a scar in the earth. Burned wood, blackened stone, a ruin everyone else had ignored. But now, it had become the center of something new. Shadow stood slowly and limped toward Caleb. The dog pressed his side against Caleb's leg and looked up at him. "You knew, didn't you?" Caleb said quietly. Shadow blinked. The dog's dark eyes reflected the evening light and the tall chimney rising behind them. Maybe it had just been instinct. Maybe luck. Or maybe the dog had simply sensed something Caleb hadn't yet understood. Either way, it had changed everything. Late that night, snow began falling again. Caleb lit the stove for its usual 2-hour burn. Flames warmed the bricks. The chimney absorbed the heat. And long after the fire faded, the warmth continued flowing quietly through the bunker. Shadow curled beside the chimney, resting his head on his paws. Outside, the valley slept beneath another blanket of snow. But this time, something had shifted. The people of Red Hollow no longer saw winter as an enemy they had to outrun. Now, they were learning how to outlast it. And at the center of that lesson stood a single chimney, and the wounded German shepherd who had found it first. Winter held Red Hollow in its grip for many more weeks. Snow came and went in waves. Some days the sky opened wide and blue above the valley, sunlight glimmering across the frozen land. Other days, the mountains sent cold winds sweeping down through the plains, bringing fresh blankets of snow that buried roads and swallowed fences. But something had changed. For the first time in years, the people of Red Hollow were not afraid of the season. They were prepared for it. At the north edge of the valley, Caleb Walker's chimney bunker continued working exactly as it had during the first storm. Each evening he burned a small fire for a short time. Each night the bricks absorbed the heat, and each morning the bunker still held its warmth. Shadow's shoulder healed slowly through the cold months. The scar remained beneath his fur, and the dog still walked with a slight limp, but his strength returned little by little. Every day he climbed the ladder beside Caleb to inspect the land above the bunker. Every day he circled the tall chimney like a guard watching over a quiet fortress. The two of them had settled into a simple rhythm: morning repairs, afternoon wood gathering, evening fires, nighttime silence. For Caleb, the quiet had become something new. In the years since returning from war, silence had always been dangerous. It gave space for memories to return, echoes of explosions, distant shouting, the sound of helicopters beating the air above desert sand. But here, the quiet of the valley felt different. Here, silence meant peace. It meant the chimney was working. It meant the bunker was warm. And it meant Shadow was resting safely beside him. One afternoon in late February, the sky changed. The hard gray clouds that had ruled the valley for months slowly began to break apart. Sunlight poured across the snow-covered prairie in long golden streaks. Caleb climbed out of the bunker and stood beside the chimney, squinting toward the mountains. Something in the air had shifted. The cold still lingered, but it had softened. Spring was beginning its slow return. Across the valley, small streams started cutting through the frozen drifts. Snow melted along fence posts and rooftops. The long Wyoming winter was finally losing its hold. Shadow stood beside Caleb, sniffing the air. For a moment, they simply watched the valley together. In the distance, smoke drifted upward from farmhouses. And something else caught Caleb's eye. Brick. Several farms now had small stone additions near their stoves. Others had dug shallow root cellar-style rooms beside their homes. The idea had spread. Not exactly the same as the bunker, but close enough. Hank Dawson rode out to visit that afternoon. He stopped his horse beside the chimney and climbed down slowly. "Thought you'd want to see something," Hank said. He pointed toward the valley. Caleb followed his gaze. Across the snow-covered fields, several houses now had thicker chimney structures rising above their roofs. Some were newly built. Others had simply been expanded. But the idea was unmistakable. Store the heat. Let the bricks do the work. Hank chuckled softly. "Whole valley's copying you now." Caleb shook his head. "They're just adapting." Hank looked down at Shadow. "Well," he said, scratching the dog gently behind the ear, "guess we should really be thanking him." Shadow wagged his tail. As the weeks passed, winter finally loosened its grip on Red Hollow. Snow melted into rushing creeks that ran through the valley. The prairie slowly returned to its dusty brown color as the frozen ground thawed. And one morning, Caleb stood beside the chimney and realized something he hadn't noticed before. The place no longer felt temporary. When he had first arrived, the burnt foundation had been nothing more than a stopping point, a place to survive until he figured out where to go next. But somewhere along the way, it had become home. Mrs. Carter visited one warm afternoon carrying a small basket. "Figured you boys could use something besides potatoes," she said with a smile. Inside the basket were fresh biscuits and a jar of honey. Shadow followed her every step, hopeful. She laughed and gave him a biscuit before leaving. "Town's talking about you two," she said before climbing back into her truck. Caleb watched her drive away down the dirt road. Shadow sat beside him, chewing happily. Later that evening, as the sun dropped behind the Wind River Mountains, the valley glowed in soft orange light. Caleb and Shadow stood beside the chimney together. The tall brick column cast a long shadow across the land that had once been nothing but burned ruin. Now it stood like a monument, not to destruction, but to survival. Caleb ran his hands slowly across the brick. When he had first arrived in Red Hollow, people had laughed at this place. They had seen ashes, failure, a mistake. But Shadow had seen something different. The dog had stood beside this chimney from the very first day, sniffing the bricks as if he understood something no one else could. Caleb looked down at him. "You knew all along, didn't you?" he said quietly. Shadow wagged his tail and sat beside the chimney exactly where he had on that first day. As the last light of the Wyoming sunset faded across the valley, Caleb realized something he hadn't felt in years. The war was behind him. The long road of drifting from place to place was behind him too. Here, beside a chimney everyone else had mocked, he had finally found something solid again. A place that had risen from ashes. A place where a wounded soldier and a loyal dog had survived the cold together. And in time, the people of Red Hollow would give that chimney a name. They called it the Veterans' Chimney. Not because it was the tallest structure in the valley, not because it was the warmest, but because it reminded them of something important. That sometimes the things people laugh at are the very things that save them. Shadow lay down beside the chimney once more, and this time the valley around them was no longer laughing. It was learning. Sometimes the strongest homes are not the ones built with the most money, but the ones built with patience, loyalty, and the courage to try when everyone else says you'll fail. Caleb Walker found a home where others saw nothing but ashes. And Shadow, the loyal German shepherd who never left his side, proved that sometimes the one who sees the truth first isn't a person at all. Now I'd love to hear from you. If you believe loyalty like Shadow's still exists in this world, write 1 in the comments. If you think every veteran deserves a second chance at peace after everything they've been through, write 0. And tell me one more thing. What state or country are you watching this story from tonight? I read every single comment, and I truly love seeing how far these stories travel around the world. And if this story moved you even a little, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because the next story might be even more incredible. Another veteran, another loyal dog, another place where hope rises from the ashes. And I can't wait to share it with you.